So I have had the enormous privilege today of spending the entire day with these three amazing women, powerful women who individually and collectively have both a deep commitment to and a very broad vision about equity in higher education. Seems like it shouldn't be a real contested topic, equity in higher education. It seems like it's a no-brainer, but it's been a long road to where we've gotten, and where we are is not far enough. These are women who have walked the talk of promoting the leadership of women and men of color in higher education, of working to make the promise of diversity and the excellence and value it can bring to institutions and the larger society, making that promise real in the lives of individuals, one by one, institution by institution. We are deeply honored by their presence on campus, and we promise to them that we will make their visit here worthwhile in our ongoing commitment to continuing to walk the talk and to make our collective endeavor a success. I'm going to briefly introduce them together so that you don't have any interruption in the flow of brilliance which you're about to hear.
My gosh.
By me.
Setting this up.
And I'm just going to go in alphabetical order. Norma Cantu, who comes to us from the University of Texas, first received her BA in 1973 at the University of Texas, Pan-American, and some years later, actually not very many years later, I don't quite know how she pulled this off. Check this out, 73 BA, 77 her JD from Harvard. She brings to us exceptional practical and policy-making experience. She's newly in the departments or the School of Law and of Education at the University of Texas, after spending 8 years serving as the Assistant Secretary of Education for Civil Rights in the Clinton administration, where she oversaw a small staff of about 850 and has had an impact way beyond. We won't even go into some of the kinds of impacts she's had because, but they're wonderful. Before that, 14 years as a regional counsel and an education director of the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. All through this time, litigating cases, preparing programs, being an incredibly inspirational leader. That is the base from which she will be talking, not to mention all the things I don't have time to mention, which involve all kinds of things in the community and beyond. Gertrude Fraser comes to us from the University of Virginia, where she is Vice Provost for Faculty Advancement. She went to that position after serving for a number of years as a program officer in higher education at the Ford Foundation. From 1998 to 2000, she was Director of Undergraduate Program in Anthropology and Associate Professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Virginia, and also was in the Carter Woodson Institute of African-American and African Studies, a very, very prominent research institute known across the country for its good works. She earned her BA from Bryn Mawr and PhD in anthropology at Johns Hopkins University and has taught at numerous institutions. Her work, which I know well as a medical anthropologist, is on African American culture, community, and identity in the diaspora, gender and science, comparative body politics, genetics, ethics, and more. All three of these wonderful women are both at the top of their fields as scholars and at the top of their fields as leaders. Dr. Yolanda Moses is currently the Vice Provost for Conflict Resolution and Special Assistant to the Chancellor. Listen to this job. I would love a job like this. Assistant to the Chancellor for Excellence and Diversity. I mean, who could want more than excellence and diversity at the University of California, Riverside? From 2000 to 2003, she was the president of the American Association for Higher Education in Washington, D.C., a job she took after serving ably as the president of the City College of New York for 6 years. In addition to that, she is a very renowned educational anthropologist, whose work I have known, and we've worked closely together for almost 25 years. Like the other two women on this panel, there are so many more accomplishments that I could read in the community, other leadership positions and at other institutions. One of my favorites is the 1995 presidency that she had of the American Anthropology Association, serving as the first African American to be president of that association. She too has published widely, particularly on issues of gender and race in higher education and cultural diversity and public policy issues. So please join me in very warmly welcoming these three amazing leaders who will now share of their expertise and then allow us to be in dialogue with them. Thank you.
We were saying, okay, who's going first? Who's going first? It's my pleasure to be here, and I am so happy coming from Southern California that it is not raining today. So thank you very much for a day without rain, because I needed that very much. This is a wonderful topic because, see, I can talk and say things to you that if I said them on my own campus, nobody would come and hear me because they've heard it so much. So it's wonderful to have an opportunity to go and talk to other people about the work that you've been thinking about and working on for many years. But I've been dealing with this issue of what do models of inclusivity look like in higher education for as long as I have been associated with higher education. And so that work started for me when I was an undergraduate student in the 60s, sitting in classrooms where I felt I was invisible and I felt voiceless because I was not a part of the discussion or a part of the dialogue unless, and in my case I was an undergraduate in sociology, the professor was talking about something very negative having to do with African-American families, and everybody would turn and look at me. Like somehow I had the answer for that. So for me, being in higher education, the issue has always been personal and political tied together. That is, the crucible of the intersection of ethnicity, race, and gender resides in my personal self. And those two things I cannot separate. So I've always been pushing that model, even before it was fashionable to do so. And I started as a graduate student with a Ford Foundation Minority Fellowship, and it was 1970, and that was the first time the Ford Foundation looked nationally at statistics and saw that women were very poorly represented in the professoriate, and so were ethnic minorities, and decided to put a fellowship together. And I was in the first group of ever doctoral students to participate in that. And so for me, it's been an opportunity to model what acting affirmatively and putting programs in place to call out issues of underrepresentation, what that can do for an institution, how that can help institutions be stronger, and how that can help institutions think differently. So as a faculty member, a young faculty member, I was involved in anthropology, and when the call came for me to get involved with working in an ethnic studies program, I did. And then there was a call for me to help a women's studies program that was going downhill. I did. And what I did was put the two together. So in the 70s, I was chair of what became an ethnic and women's studies department, which meant, again, I had to model for an institution what this meant. How do issues of ethnicity and gender and sexuality come together, and what does it look like in an academic environment? And so we worked on curriculum issues at that time. Then I took a dare and became an administrator, because my dean, I kept telling my dean what a poor job he was doing. And he said, well, if you think you can do it better, why don't you try it? And he was, saying it laughingly. Well, he got fired about 6 months later, and the provost said, how would you like to step into this job? And I thought they were kidding, because I figured they definitely didn't want me, because I was an activist, and I came of age in the 60s and was very much I was a community organizer. So my community organizing skills were what I brought to the academy, and that's what, how I became an administrator. I learned how to work the system, and so I became acting dean, and then realized I could do this job, and that was it. My academic career and my administrative career have always been in parallel together, so they're interchangeable. So for me, the research that I've done over the past 25 years is to turn the anthropological lens on the institution of higher education and to look at it from a variety of angles, and to try and help make some sense in this pluralistic society, that if we really cared about inclusiveness, what would it look like institutionally? And what are the barriers that stand in the way of this really, truly happening at various levels of the institution? One of the things I see happening in higher education is that 25 years ago, we talked about diversity in terms of social justice. And while that is still important, there have been some other ways that I've seen institutions also take this issue and make it central to their institution. And I think as we look at where we are with diversity and where diversity is going, that these are some of the pathways that institutions can look at in addition to social justice, especially at a time when the political climate and the cultural climate in our country may be becoming more conservative in some places around these issues. So how to continue to embrace and institutionalize these issues in institutions? Well, you tie diversity and the value of inclusivity to larger cultural issues. These are not just about what happens to individuals as they come into the institution, but how is the institution itself being responsive to the students? So what are some other factors? Well, there's a whole issue of demographic change that's taking place. And in some states like California, New York, Florida, Texas, that has to do with ethnicity. And so you see that also happening in higher education, that the very students you have are students that are representative of America. In some places where that's not the case of ethnicity, it certainly is the case of gender. And so you see under higher education, undergraduates especially, just about any institution is at least 50% female. And the question then is, are we organized to do the work that is going to provide our students with the best education they can get? So the demographic issue translates into institutional excellence questions that you have to ask about teaching and learning issues, about issues of outcomes, about issues about how our students are faring. And so you move this issue from the margins, as it has been historically, into the center of institutional effectiveness. And that's the kind of work that I do when I go into colleges and universities and talk to people, how to do this kind of work. There's another issue. Since 9/11, we've been talking about the role of America in the world and what students need to know in order to live and function in that world. And this is where the whole issue of diversity and globalization come together. That is, how do we create, when we say, a competently educated undergraduate student needs to be competent in certain things, right? Technology, effective communications. Well, you also have to have that whole complex of competencies around cultural issues and around globalization issues, because whether you stay in Eugene or not, you're going to be functioning in a world that's going to call on you to know how to deal with difference and to understand yourself in relationship to that difference. That's a diversity issue. And that's not something that's peripheral. That's something that's very central to the kind of educational excellence that you get. So you get presidents from institutions like Stanford and Michigan and Wisconsin who say that we're not an excellent institution if we're not dealing with the issue of diversity in very concrete and very structural ways. But people who live in and work in the environment don't always know how to do this work, And so that's a part of what we do here, Gertrude and Norma and myself, from our various vantage points. We're helping our institutions be more global. So then we circle back to core values. That is, if diversity is a part of the core values of the institution, then everybody's job is to figure out how to do it in their respective positions within the organization. So it's everything from recruitment to retention to graduation for undergraduates, to who we hire as faculty and staff, how well they fare, do they stay. All these issues are diversity issues. Diversity is also happening at a time when higher education itself is in flux. That is, how the 4,000 institutions of higher education in our country are re-examining who they are in the 21st century. And you have to remember, maybe you don't know this, but these institutions are over 1,000 years old in terms of the structure that we have. And what we're finding is that these medieval structures might have worked in medieval times, but this is the 21st century, and so there are a lot of things we're doing now that we're rethinking, we're re-questioning the relationship of teaching and learning. For example, we know that lecturing does not give students the kind of learning that we want them to have. But it's very difficult to move from that model of lecturing to the dialogic kind of model, because that's not how faculty learn in graduate school how to do that work. Pedagogy, teaching about pedagogy is not something that you learn in graduate schools. It's something that you pick up or maybe don't pick up on your own. So we also know that there's a disconnect between the universities, particularly research universities, and their immediate communities, so that what used to be the mission of, say, land-grant universities or purpose-driven universities sometimes can get lost. And you don't have clearly on board the communities that would support the kind of work that you want to do. And so the whole model of what it means to be an engaged university is at question in the United States. We're looking at tidal wave 2 coming down the path to our universities. That is, the children of the baby boomers, more immigrant populations coming into the university, and more women returning to universities. So rather than less diversity, the future of higher education is more diversity in terms of who the students are that are coming to us. And we're also finding that the success of ethnic minority students in the United States still primarily for African Americans are in historically black colleges and universities, and for Hispanic students in minority-serving institutions, and for American Indians and tribal colleges. Predominantly white institutions are not as successful in educating students of color. That's a reality. So the question is, what do we do about that? Does the University of Oregon and the University of California, in my case, just say, oh, well, we can't do that? This is something, again, that administrators are grappling with. So those are the issues in which we find the discussions of diversity taking place, and in environments where there are less resources. And I know that's an issue here. But it's an issue everywhere. And so you hear the mantra, well, we do it if we have the money. And what we say is, you do it if you want to be an excellent institution. That's why you do diversity work. So if we were, as we look forward, and if we think about what's coming down the pipeline, we ask ourselves, how do we do this work? What are the kinds of things that we would do? Well, to look at this issue systemically, what we have to do is interrogate the status quo. That is, the way we operate today is not working in terms of diversity. Institutional structures are not working. So individually, we question what we're doing as individuals. Collectively, how are we operating as departments? Institutionally, what is our institution doing and how are we doing vis-a-vis other institutions in our category? You are the University of Oregon. How are you doing with other universities, your peer institutions, along this issue? Consortially, are there ways you can partner with other institutions to do this work? And then nationally, how is the institution working nationally? And we have to ask the question, as a pluralistic democracy, the basic question we have to ask ourselves is higher education for what? And if it isn't to help create a better society, if part of that answer does not include helping to create a better society for my state and for my community, then that is a problem in the 21st century. We also have to ask ourselves, do we have the kind of paths to success? Are there multiple paths to success for our students? Are we cognizant of the fact that we're going to have this multiplicity of different kinds of students coming? We're going to want the delivery of their services in these many ways. Are we organized to do this work? Are we organized to give the kind of educational service that we need to? And are our students going elsewhere? Are they going to other kinds of institutions? And the fastest growing institution of higher education in this country are proprietary institutions. And those are institutions that have just-in-time education. They might not be as the caliber or the highest quality of the University of Oregon, but that's where people are going. And women and minorities are going to these institutions in higher and higher and higher numbers every year. So that's a reality. How useful is a doctoral degree? There's a big national movement to interrogate the doctoral degree. That is, are faculty being trained to teach and do research in the kinds of institutions, being trained to do research in the kinds of institutions where they're going to find jobs? There are only so many research universities to go around. So there will be some faculty who will end up in teaching institutions, in community colleges, in places where they're not given the kind of education they need at the doctoral level to do that work. And with the increasing number of women in my ethnic underrepresented minorities going into doctoral programs, the question is, are they going to be competitive in that arena? The other national issue that I didn't talk about is the fact that there's going to be a dearth. I mean, half of the professors in the United States are going to be retiring eligible to retire by 2015. And there are no succession plans. There are very few institutions that have succession plans. They're planning for that to happen in a systematic way. So there's no guarantee that just because you get into this doctoral pipeline that you're going to be a part of the new professoriate unless we interrogate the status quo. So as we look to the future, part of what research institutions can add to this mix is the fact that they are research institutions. And so a lot of the issues and the questions we raise are researchable. These are issues that really can be done in an empirical way. So I would urge, one of the things I would urge is institutions like this focus on the research around diversity and look at diversity in new ways. Why are women and, well, particularly underrepresented minorities, why are they not as successful in predominantly white institutions as they are in other kinds of institutions? What is happening in institutions that purport to want to be inclusive that create the kind of dropout rates, the high dropout rates that happen? We also need to look at research that is what we call praxis, research that comes together in a very practical way so that we're looking at praxis. How do you take what you are learning and put it into practice, both on your own campus and in service to higher education in general. That's an issue that that research universities can do in terms of helping the whole diversity agenda. We're also interested in, as we look down the road, for new models of leadership around diversity. And I would recommend the research or the writing of Laura Rendon here, where she talks about new contracts that leaders in higher education need to question the assumptions of leadership models that we have now. Leadership models that say leaders look a certain way, leaders act a certain way. How do we create, if we're bringing in diversity into our ranks, how do we create opportunities for these women and people of color to be a part of leadership and to bring their own cultural experiences into the leadership role, so that a commitment of diversity is a commitment to new ways of thinking, to new ways of knowing, to new ways of seeing leadership in higher education. I'm involved with a couple of research projects that are looking at success, diversity and success, that is institutions where a commitment to diversity has been sustained for at least over a decade. And what does that leadership, what do those leadership models look like? And what is it that we can learn from them to share with other institutions who want to do this work, but who seem to be stymied in terms of how to do that work? This is a group of women and men who themselves are progressive in terms of their thinking about leadership. They think outside of the box about leadership, that leadership is not top-down, but leadership is situational, and leaders can be anybody who has the ability to see and to know. So new leadership models are very, very important for us as well. Finally, it's going to be important for institutions like yours to be in partnership with other institutions. We talked today with folks who are looking to diversify the faculty, and it isn't going to happen if you sit and just wait for the faculty to come to you. You're going to have to go out and find those faculty. You're going to have to create that faculty, and you can only do that in partnership with institutions that have a good track record of graduating women in the sciences, for example, or men of color in certain fields. You need to be able to get young graduates, doctoral students right out of graduate school. You need to be able to get senior folks from institutions. So partnering with other institutions, whether they be HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, minority-serving institutions, tribal colleges, community colleges, places where the pipeline is already filled up with people you say you want. These people have to become authentic partners with you. So this means doing things differently than you have done before. And I will just end by saying that women and men of color have to also be a part of the leadership that's helping institutions think through these models. They cannot be bystanders in their own in this process. They have to be very active agents of change, and that begins with students. Students have to become a part of this process of thinking about the future of the institution and of diversity. It can't be done without students, faculty, and staff. So to change this institution and to make it better off is to embrace diversity in institutional ways, because when you embrace diversity and do the kind of transformational change that happens in institutions, it is not only good, and this research bears this out with the Michigan case especially, it is not only good for the women and for the men of color, but it makes the whole institution a better place for everybody. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank Sandy Morgan and Greg Vincent, and the other members of the administration and faculty who've invited me here today. I don't think I'd be a kind of natural pick for this. So I want to thank Sandy in particular for, I think we talked when at the National Council for Research on Women conference, and she was going on and on about women's studies and its marginality, and I was like, And the next thing I got was an email inviting me out, and I was very happy to come. I, like Yolanda, I want to tell you a little bit about my background as a way into the discussion of why these issues matter so much to me, and also why I care so much about the academy. I could care about a lot of other things, but why I care about so much about higher ed. And then I'll use that as a way of thinking about these questions. I'm an immigrant from Jamaica. My mother came here in the 1970s, and then about 2 years later, she, as we say in Jamaica, sent for us. And we came to New York City, to Brooklyn, Bed-Stuy. And so I grew up in Brooklyn. I went to high school at Stuyvesant High School. And then pretty much once I went to Stuyvesant, which is, anybody from New York?
I went to Bronx Science.
Oh, yeah. Bronx Science was a heavy rival. Although we never had teams or anything, but somehow there was a lot of competition. My sister went to Brooklyn Tech, and there's all this competition in these high schools that are public institutions with a mission of excellence. Sounds familiar. That drew the sons and daughters of immigrants. You had to take this test to get in. But it drew on all the, I went to a junior high school in Bed-Stuy, a little back-of-the-wall high school off of Decatur Avenue. But some of my teachers heard about this test, and I took it, and I got into Stuyvesant. And basically, once I got into Stuyvesant, really, my life was set. It really was set. And I think that I began to understand as an immigrant kid the value of education in the United States. You've heard it before, and I'm going to say it again, but it's true. I mean, in the United States, and because I know other societies where it's extremely difficult to break out of social class, extremely difficult. There still is a possibility through higher education for some form of social mobility. I mean, that's why I'm so committed to it, because I feel in a way that, the fact that I am where I am comes out of that possibility. And I see that possibility narrowing tremendously, just narrowing down. And I'm like, this isn't good. This isn't good for anybody. It certainly isn't good for folks who follow behind me who are immigrants, but it's not good for the domestically colonized, to use an old term. It's not good for them either. It's not good for poor folks who can't afford to get in anymore. And so this is why this matters to me so much, that I see that narrowing possibility. And I think all the work around diversity and excellence is to push it back open and to say this actually, it's not allowed. It's not allowed. It's not allowed to shut down one of the sole forms of mobility that's left, and where everybody can feel like they have ownership of it. And that's why this work is extremely important to me. The other thing is that I know a few other institutions where there is a possibility to have a life of the mind, where you can think and it's okay to do that, and that you can test out new ideas where, and again, I always have to be sort of, I'll say something and then I have to bracket it, but I think that the possibility of failing, that it's okay to fail and try again, that the academy allows for that to happen, and even has a kind of ideological position on that failure is a way of testing out hypothesis. In fact, when I try to apply for grants as an anthropologist, and NIH and NSF always says you have to have a hypothesis that is open to being falsified, and I always have to figure out what that means in terms of getting a grant. But it's an institute, so it's a place where you can have ideas, lay them out there, fail at them, try again, and the stakes aren't that there's an expectation that you're going to fail and there's another path. And so this is why this is a place, higher ed is a place that really matters to me. And that's why I keep trying to hammer away at some of this stuff. Okay, the other thing that I think is extremely important is that in the time that I've been in the university, the work that has gone on across the intersections of disciplines has been tremendously powerful. Talking about the emergence about 30 years or so ago of African-American studies, just put that there and I'll come back to it. Women's studies, ethnic studies, Latino, Chicano studies, Native American studies, all these fields that, if you think about it for a little bit, they seem very peripheral. They have not, in many ways, come to the center of the university. When you think about where are the high prestige disciplines, your mind doesn't fall on women's studies, it doesn't fall on African American studies. So they're institutionally marginalized, these interdisciplinary fields. But yet I would argue that they have been central to the survival of American academy, absolutely central to it. And so the thing that's the thing that I puzzle about so much is, how could these fields on the margins be so important for the vitality, the sustainability, the long-term potential of the university? And it is a conundrum. So I have always taught, I'm an anthropologist, but all my appointments have been joint with African American studies and women's studies. So I think about these intersections and why it is that I feel, and I'm going to try to make the case for it, that they're so vital to the survival of the American academy. Anybody agree with me on that? It's a tough one, but I feel like, it's true. And they've done it on the margins. And I think the same thing for minority groups, for immigrants in the United States, marginalized. The guys at the corner of 7-Eleven waiting for the contractor to come and not pay them for 2 months. And yet they are what's so vital about our society. And I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, and now I see, because we have an international, what's it called, refugee center, all right, in Charlottesville. About a year ago, and I'm coming back, about a year ago, I started seeing walking like these women with these brightly colored scarves wrapped around their heads and with 3 or 4 kids in tow, and they were black, but I knew they were not African American. I'm like, who are these people? I mean, they're just, and first of all, in Charlottesville now, nobody walks, okay, because everybody has a car. I'm like, what are they doing walking, in inappropriate places? Who are these people? And it turns out that they are Somali Bantus who were resettled in Charlottesville. And here they are kind of making their way in this new society. And I'm like, this is the life of the United States. Because, their children, give their children 10 years. They're struggling right now. The language issues, the schooling issues, they come from a place where they were enslaved historically. But I now see some of these kids just on the margins. They're getting on the bus. They have their bicycles. I mean, you see them riding around town. And I think a couple more years, these are the kids that are going to be in the university. They will come with this incredible experience, this incredible hardship that they have managed to endure and succeed in. And I'm telling you, it's really, this is the lifeblood of the United States. And I find sometimes that my more privileged students, and I got to put my kid who is 12 years old, she's extremely privileged in a way I never was. They can't, I mean, any little bit of hardship and they start to crumble. The first B, the first C, you know, they're like all tied up into knots, you know, not getting into medical school. They don't have that toughness that comes out of that form of hardship and endurance. And I think, if, you know, we can't rely on these very privileged students for the health of the United States by themselves. It's not going to happen. We need that toughness, you know, that the kids who sort of had their mothers wrapped up in these colors and, you know, not having the right kind of clothes in winter and having folks laugh at them. We need these kinds of folks for the life of the university. And that's when I hear Yolanda talk about diversity and excellence, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about why we need all of these folks for the strength and the health of these our institutions. And how to make the case make people really believe that. That's the hard part, because it's so, I'm telling you, it's so true. But how to get people to believe it, that's the part I think that's very difficult in higher education. Anyway, so let me go back now to why I feel like these interdisciplinary fields have been so crucial. Just to pick one moment, the emergence of African-American studies in the late 1960s in university. I just want to remind you about what was going on then. Most of you lived it. Many of you, no, not most of you anymore. How many people were sort of just beginning graduate school or getting into college during the late 1960s, early 1970s in the room? It's a good portion. You remember, I mean, these places were going to get burnt down, basically.
That's right.
You know, they were shooting students. The place like Johns Hopkins, just down the street, people were burning down grocery stores. They were getting close. They were right up against the university, all right? Right up against the university. Universities were shutting down. They were just closing shop. Those who had gates were probably locking the gates. And what began to happen is that you got a group of often very young graduate students. These people were not even folks who had finished their PhDs, who began to argue for the opening up of the university to, in the first instance, African-American students. And universities began sending down representatives with white flags to inner city neighborhoods, and they began recruiting, putting them on buses and taking them up to Vassar and to Cornell and to literally just bringing them in. These students into these universities. I don't know if you can recall some of this. I mean, I've heard stories about what that was like from some of those first students, you know, particularly at Vassar. I mean, hilarious stories about these folks coming in from urban New Jersey and New York to Vassar, and the hell they raised and the way that they really pushed their professors and the maidens were trying to teach them how to drink tea properly. But in a way, having those students in those places, and then some of them became faculty members or helped to begin African-American studies and women's studies programs fresh out of getting their BAs, you know, taking over institutions, starting curriculum. To me, it's just amazing what they did. And I think in doing that, they literally stopped these universities from burning down. They really did, because they then began in some ways to work on the universities. And to work on these disciplines, to work on the margins, and in some kind of way I think that work of transforming these institutions consumed these people. I don't think they necessarily benefited the most from it. They died young, they got bitter and disillusioned often, or they'd never really achieved their dreams because they had to do a lot of this work. They got pushed aside once some of this stuff got mainstream. But what I'm saying is that first wave, take the field of history. History is nothing like what it was in the late 1960s as a result of the work of some of these early student radicals. Nothing like what it was. But would any historian say that it was African American studies that gave rise to the birth of social history, to the study of slavery? No, African American studies is still that thing over in the edge that's barely surviving. But history now is just an incredibly different discipline as a result of the pushes against a field where, I mean, you know, I can remember some of this early stuff where people say there's no archive to get us, we can't really do slavery because the archives aren't there. You couldn't even say that anymore. I mean, these fields have just been transformed, and I could just name them, you know, women's studies and the changes that women's studies has made to English. So that's what I mean, that the excellence of our institutions, the knowledge claims that now can be made in the sciences that could not have been made before, came out of these marginalized disciplines and these marginalized peoples. And I think that's, if we remember that, then I think this iteration of the work, it gives us a way into thinking about it. You know, what does it mean when we talk about excellence and diversity? Because that's kind of what we're saying in a way. That we're going to flounder. We are floundering again if we don't take this seriously. One more thing I have to say, and then I'm going to sit down, is that the reason that it's so hard is because it's hard. All right, it's no two ways about it. It's hard, and I think that universities, just like any complex organization, they pretty much run on their own. It's in a way, you know, I'm just filling a function. It doesn't matter who I am. A lot of the functions that I do as an administrator, I'm just in place, and I have a brain, and I'm breathing, and so on, and so I can pretty much get the work done. The organizational structure is there. And the things, you know, the faculty get hired, the money gets dispersed, the president raises money, and, you know, they pretty much operate on their own. And if you think about Xerox, IBM, AT&T, Enron, that's a more recent one, private companies, businesses, and so on, they come and go. But universities, they stay around a long time, and I think they stay around because of their complexity and in some ways the fact that people can fill the roles. You can teach the students, you can get things done, and they have a kind of enduring quality about them. So the thing that kind of, the thing that makes diversity hard is that it's a real measure of institutional effectiveness when you can't just do things in the ordinary kind of way where things just work. And that's why it's a real measure of institutional effectiveness, the extent to which institutions can do diversity well. Because it really requires everything to work. It requires commitment. It requires struggle. It requires kinds of thinking that we're not used to doing, because you got to put all these pieces together, and they have to kind of work at the same time. And so that's why it's so hard, you know, and I think it's a good measure of institutional effectiveness to say, are we really working well as an institution? Look to how we do diversity, and you begin to figure what's on automatic pilot and what's not, what's really sort of taking thinking. And so this is the work that we have to do as institutions, is to use diversity as a kind of gauge of how effective we are organizationally, and how much we're really thinking about what we do. That's my take on this stuff, and I'm going to be very interested in fielding questions afterwards.
Okay, I'm grateful you invited me, but how do I follow these two wonderful women? I just can't. I'm going to try to do three things with you all first. I want to give you the inside scoop on how I got a job to manage a budget of $54 million, because I'm sure that's what you really want out of this speech, right? I'm going to talk about the connection between the fight for equal opportunity on behalf of women and men, and then I want to talk about the connection between gender issues and race and national origin and color issues. And I think those connections are important because we all need allies. I mean, we all need to be there for each other in order for diversity to work. So how do I get a $54 million job? I was programmed to be a teacher. My mom, 3 aunts, 2 brothers, sister, and I all taught. And I should have been a teacher, but I'd wanted to be a lawyer as long as I can remember. So how many law students in the room? Raise your hand. Proud to be a lawyer, okay? When my mom found out I'd been accepted at Harvard Law School, she told me I was a teacher gone bad. I mean, I had already tried teaching 8th graders, and I knew a judge and 12 jurors would be a lot easier than a class of 31 8th graders. And my dad didn't want me to go to Harvard, partly because it was so far away, partly because it was so expensive, but mostly because I was 19 years old in 1 month. I was a teenage law student, yes. I had baggage, okay? I was the first person from my university to be accepted to Harvard Law School. So if I failed, the whole university would look bad. I was the first Hispanic woman born in the U.S. There was a Hispanic woman before me born in Mexico, so I was the first U.S.-born Latina to be accepted to law school at Harvard. So if I failed, my entire niche in the census would look bad. I couldn't tell which affirmative action they used to get me in. Was it because I was South Texan, because I was a teenager, because I was a female, because I was Latina? And I didn't care. I was just delighted because my undergrad campus, which was 90% Latino, 10% white, 0% African, nope, there were 4 African Americans on the basketball team, had no diversity for me. And I got up there and I ran into people of all of the U.S., from all of these countries, all social classes, people who were poor like I was. My mom picked cotton. You know, I'm telling you, we're poor. People who were fabulously wealthy, didn't know how to scramble an egg because they'd always had a cook. And I enjoyed finding out everybody had to read 150 pages a night, just like I did. We were all on the same level playing field. We all had, no one took tests for us. If you came in on affirmative action, that didn't mean someone was going to sit and take the exam for you. You had to pass the same exams and prepare for the next class day, just like everyone else. And for the first time, I didn't make straight A's, but I was happy about that. And I've always heard, and I've read this somewhere, that the reason some of us got in there was to kind of like cut back on the suicide rates, because some of us had earned those B's and C's. And I never thought of that as harassment when people would say that, because I knew that I was going to do something with that degree. And I came back and just started suing everybody with that degree. I came back to Texas, and I sued the same school district that educated me. Whoa. They were not complying with a Court of Appeals decision that involved undocumented children having the right to go to public school. The court had already ruled my hometown, my school district, would not admit the children. And so I got the pleasure of putting my high school principal on the witness stand and cross-examining him. Now, tell me you don't all dream you had done that, okay? Now, my mother was working for the school district at the time, and boy, was she mad at me. But hey, come on, we won. I went and sued the University of Texas system and the A&M system and the governor because of unequal funding to colleges. The theory was, if you can do a school finance case like Serrano in California, alleging inequitable funding based on where in the state you are, why can't you do that for colleges and allege the same thing under the state constitution? We wanted the district court, but to win, I had to sue my alma mater, AfricanAmerican University, and I got to put my college president on the witness stand and cross-examine him. It went up to the state Supreme Court, and they said, Norma, your theory is correct. You can sue public elementary and secondary. You just can't sue colleges because. And they said, and didn't the legislature give your client $660 million as a remedy? So if you've got close to $1 billion, we think you've already won. This case is moot. My clients said, Norma, can you lose another case for us really soon? Because we really liked how you lost that last one. And that's the way I got to my job, where I was given a budget of $54 million, because I'd had experience dealing with civil rights enforcement. I had experience supervising attorneys in very large, very complex cases. And I had experience with planning ahead for a remedy even before the appeal is over. I mean, even before we file a lawsuit, we had an idea of what the solution was going to look like, because we were so optimistic we'd thought, well, we're going to win, so someone's going to ask us, what do you want as relief? And we had a map, we had a roadmap already planned out for what the solution looked like. That idea of having to have a vision, having to have a roadmap, having to have some idea of what a good solution looks like is a very important lesson. I learned it the hard way. I learned that lesson when I had a job at the Attorney General's office immediately out of law school, and our job was to sue nursing homes that defrauded the elderly. And our job was to investigate nursing homes. So we'd set the alarm and drop in at midnight and do an investigation. And the smell would greet us. There'd be nobody on duty. We'd walk into some grandmother's bedroom with no one to say, no, don't go in there. There was no one to give them medication, no one to take care of their pain. We'd bring a lawsuit on behalf of these elderly folk and found out that the only remedy a judge could give is to shut the place down. We're trying to help folk, and we're creating sick, elderly, homeless. So we learned a lesson the tough way after having that decision. You've got to be thinking about, if you send a lawsuit forward, what's that lawsuit going to produce? What's the relief you want? What's your purpose? What's your mission? What's your goal here? And I learned that lesson the hard way, and I've carried that lesson in my heart through my whole life. Every time you bring a problem forward to an administration, you better have a sense of what the consequences are of the remedy to that problem. Will you help some folk? Will you hurt some folk? What does that cost-benefit analysis look like? You come forward with that idea of what you think a solution. It could be a straw proposal, something that you haven't totally costed out, you haven't totally thought it out, but bring something to the table other than a complaint. And it was a lesson hard learned, but a lesson that I talked to the White House about, and they said, you're the person we want in charge of this budget of $54 million. Well, what did I do with $54 million? I asked people who worked for me, if you were the boss, what would you do? And I encourage that to happen in any administration, whether it's a college administration or whether it's an agency administration. The boss should describe what the challenges are and then turn to the folk who are working in the organization and ask them, do you have another way to do this? And then listen to the answers, because that dialogue has to happen. Now, your answers may make no sense whatsoever because you just don't have the experience, the background, but just merely being asked makes a huge difference. At least that's what my staff told me, that just being asked, what would you do if you were boss, made them feel connected and made them feel like they were part of the solution. It also tipped me off to some things I could do that were good and tipped me off to some things I wanted to avoid doing. All right. What was the experience like? I asked African American communities what were the top 3 things you'd want done in civil rights in the country. They talked about affirmative action. They talked about racial harassment. They talked about a pent-up backlog, a caseload that was sitting for 10, 12 years. I asked Latino groups, they had 3 priorities. I asked women groups, and they had a list of 56 top priorities. Because women groups deal by consensus. Everything that's mentioned becomes a priority. Okay? You know, right? Right? Okay. So this side of the room, give me 3 things that you think the women's groups wanted taken care of. 3 things that have to do with women's issues. That have to do with education, students. Come on, this is interactive. This is late in the afternoon. Sex education, good. What else? Students? Child care. Students, what else? Science and math. Okay. This side of the room, give me 3 things. Tuition. Funding for students by gender. What else?
Women in higher administration.
Higher administration. Very good. What else? Poverty. Okay. This room, give me 133 reasons. Oh, okay. I won't do that to you. Okay. What I heard from their list, and this was not that long ago because I had these meetings in '94, they wanted to see sexual harassment in elementary, secondary, and as well as college. They wanted also to protect employees of universities from sexual harassment. They wanted to deal with gender gaps in high-wage vocational education jobs. You know, those preparations that lead to the high-wage jobs. They wanted to talk about Title IX athletics in the high schools as well as in the colleges. They wanted to see financial aid gaps closed because they believed that there were gaps, that more guys were getting funds than girls. And that was true, by the way, in some areas. The National Merit Scholarship Program was showing a pretty big gap in 1994. They wanted to see women promoted to management and administrative positions. They wanted to see women not steered out of certain majors, such as computer sciences. They wanted to see achievement gaps closed, and by the way, we did that. In 1999, girls were performing just as poorly as boys in math. Hey, check that one, done. They wanted to see a remedy for single-sex classes that were not educationally beneficial to girls and boys. They wanted to see an end of stereotypes based on sexual orientation. They wanted to see funding of women's programs, women's educational programs. They wanted to see comparable facilities for women and extracurricular activities. They wanted to see bias taken out of the textbooks. They wanted to see an end to pregnancy discrimination among students and employees. They wanted to see equal housing opportunities. They wanted to see financial aid equity. I mentioned that one already. They wanted to see no discrimination based on marital status. They wanted to see effective grievance procedures. And they also had issues they wanted taken care of for the boys. They wanted boys' academic deficits, particularly with verbal and writing skills, addressed. They wanted to see a solution for the dropouts that were greater for boys than girls, a solution for the over-disciplining of boys and the over-referral of boys to special education programs. And they wanted to see why there were some disciplines like veterinary science where there were more girls than boys. So, you know, with a list that long, it was going to be a failure because there was no way I could produce a remedy, a solution, an answer for a list that long. But I rolled up my sleeves, my staff got to work, and we did the best we could. We did put out guidance on sexual harassment. We said a 6-year-old kissing a 6-year-old was not committing sexual harassment. Thank you. We said that before the Previn case came out of the South. But what was undone, what was still remaining, was really big. And here's where the connection comes up. Where there's still bias out there, where there are still stereotypes out there, it affects all of us, all of us. If there's bias on the basis of race, it affects us as women. If there's bias against us as women, it affects people on the basis of their national origin. And I'll give you one example, and I'll close with that example. There was a case in Alabama called Alexander versus Sandoval, and law students, it's at 532 U.S. 275. It's a Supreme Court 2001 case. A Spanish-speaking applicant for a driver's license in Alabama was denied because he was told, you have to take this test completely in English. And he said, wait a minute, you know, I just want to show I can drive. I don't want to write the great American novel. Okay? And he said it was an impact. It was a neutral policy, but it was having a disproportionately negative impact on Spanish speakers. They said, oh, go away. And it went up on appeal, and in fact, the ruling that came from the court out of Alabama, federal court, was you can't bring a lawsuit like this. Only the U.S. government can sue under Title VI if you're alleging effects. You have to show intentional discrimination. It's because you're of that national origin group. That's why that policy was put in place. And of course, he can't read the minds of folk who wrote this policy, so he couldn't do the mind reading, so he couldn't prove that. The Court of Appeals, which is the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, agreed that he can't bring this kind of lawsuit. And the U.S. Supreme Court agreed he cannot bring this kind of lawsuit. He has to wait for someone in the U.S. Department of Justice to have the time to file this kind of case. They're never going to make time. But why does this matter? Well, in that same state of Alabama, Roderick Jackson, a male, a basketball coach at a high school, brought a complaint that his girl students were getting inequitable facilities, that his female basketball players were being discriminated against compared to his male basketball players. Equipment wasn't the same, time wasn't the same, support and funding wasn't the same, and he was demoted. They wrote him up and said he was an ineffective coach. They demoted him, they sent him back to the classroom, and they took away a big chunk of his paycheck. Well, he says, hey, wait a minute, I'm speaking up the truth here, and this is a civil rights violation, and I'm being retaliated against, I'm being discriminated against, I'm going to file a lawsuit. Well, the court said, remember that other case involving the Spanish-speaking applicant for the driver's license? You can't file a lawsuit. You have to wait for the U.S. Department of Justice to file a lawsuit. There is no retaliation under Title IX unless you're the female victim of the discrimination. And they cited the case dealing with the Spanish-speaking driver. Okay? This is a case the U.S. Supreme Court has accepted. The U.S. Department of Justice filed a brief saying, I can't file all these cases. And they're actually taking the side of the male basketball coach, saying for Title IX to work, we need to be able to allow teachers who are close to the facts to be able to report those facts. And we need to be able to let them do it safely without them fearing that they're going to lose their jobs. And this is what Congress expected, and it's a very reasonable interpretation of the law. And if you want to read about the Jackson case, oh goodness, it's Roderick Jackson versus Birmingham Board of Education. It's docket number 02-1672, and you can get that online on the usdoj.gov website. So these are connected. These are connected. Race and gender are connected. What kind of country are we going to have if the Supreme Court rules that it's okay for a government agency to retaliate against somebody for speaking up on behalf of someone else? It's an opportunity for all of us if the court rules correctly, because all of us can become allies to each other. And I'm not saying file a lot of lawsuits. I'm not saying file a lot of complaints. I'm just saying be there for each other, support each other to be sure that diversity is fleshed out in fact more than just words. If the court, however, continues to affirm what the court did out of Alabama, we need to use our voices. We need to speak up, because Congress will need to make clear that Title IX includes protections of retaliation, that this is not a correct court interpretation of Title IX. How does this fit in to what we're meeting about today? I think it adds to my personal sense of urgency. All my life I've been in a hurry. I finished high school when I was 16, I finished college when I was 19, finished law school when I was 22, been litigating for 25 years, and I'm always in a hurry. But guys, we're all in a hurry right now. Sandra O'Connor, Justice O'Connor, some years back, because Michigan wasn't just a few months ago, gave us 25 years to get our Higher Education Act together. And 25 years is a blink in the eye. Places like Harvard are 300 years old. You know, universities as institutions, as structures have been around centuries. 25 years will go before we know it. And we've got to act with a sense of urgency. That means that we need to be thoughtful about it. We need to plan ahead in terms of what do we want to look in place. We need to have a lot of dialogue about what the campuses are going to look like and what the institutions are going to look like that we leave to the next generation. But we've only got one generation to fix it. And we should do it with allies. I teach disability law, not because I'm a person with a disability, because I want to feel I'm an ally to that community. Their community is my community. But for an accident of birth or an accident, I could be a person with a disability. And so I want to support folk who are the other. And I don't give up any piece of myself to support the other. I'm still me. I'm still who I am, the person with baggage. But I'm a former 8th grade teacher, and I'm giving you guys homework. And your homework is to get involved. Get involved, be an ally, be the supporter for someone else that you would want to be a supporter. This high school coach, this man, this white guy, has supporters from every women's group, from athletic organizations, from the U.S. Department of Justice, from the White House, because he's speaking the truth. Thank you.
So the floor is open. There is a mic in the front to ask any questions you may have.
Cool. Comments. Yeah, comments are good.
I don't think I need a mic.
Yeah.
Okay. I have 2 girlfriends who graduated last year, and the job market didn't look very good for them. So they're back in school, in graduate school. And I was thinking about this, and I was just kind of surfing the web and looking at some stuff. And I found a document that had percentages of minorities and percentages of different genders at different universities. And so I looked up the University of Oregon. And it said, I have no idea if this is accurate or not. It was from Time Life, so, you know, it could be questionable, there's no doubt about it. But it said that last year, that undergraduates at the university, that there were 84% women in the undergraduate class at the University of Oregon. And I was floored by that. And the only thing that I could think was that, well, that must be related to the job opportunities, the resources that are available for women out there in the job marketplace. So, any comments on that?
But do you know what the percentage is? It's a little over. I know it's 50 plus in most campuses.
But it also, I don't remember any other specific numbers, but it was very high for women at universities all over the country.
That's right.
And there's 2 causes. One is boys are not making it through the whole pipeline. So there is some reason to be concerned about how boys are doing, particularly boys of color. Okay, but the other is that if you look under the website for the National Partnership for Women and Girls, or National Partnership for Families, it used to be the Women's Law Center, but I think it's called National Partnership for Families. They're doing specific research targeted at vocational education and how more boys are getting access to training programs that are preparing them for tech jobs and high-wage jobs, and girls are missing out on that. So I think your theory is going to be supported by some of their research, that the guys are not in college because they have jobs already.
This was a particular concern a few years ago from presidents at private universities, because they were looking at their alumni base and the fact that women's jobs tend to be a lot lower than, in terms of income, than male jobs. In 20 years or 15 years down the road, what kind of giving will come back to the institution? And so for that reason, they were really interested in raising the number of male students in the institution. That was a conversation, a real conversation that they had at a national conference. I think it's good that women are in colleges and universities. There's also a question about the feminization of education, and to what extent does it push against male culture, and to what extent are males comfortable in high school, for example, and getting through that pipeline. So it's a complicated issue, but on the whole, I think it's a good idea that women are educated, because, with one out of every 2 marriages ending in divorce, you can imagine that women are going to have to take care of themselves in this country. That's a reality. So that's not a bad thing. The question is how to get more boys in, yes, but I think the fact that there are 80% or 50% women in all institutions, we should all pat ourselves on the back, and Norma for the good work that was done out of the Department of Justice.
thing I want to say about that is that the presence of women in of itself does not mean that you get transformational institutions that are transformed by their presence. And so how we get these women to see their fates connected to questions of equity and access for underrepresented groups, and that they have a role to play in transforming the institutions that they're in. I think that's the hard part. And you can be a feminist from very different points, political points. And I think in some ways how to get these women a good feminist education so that they can really take care of themselves and have their political voices heard. I think that's a part that institutions are not necessarily thinking about. But I feel like it's really important to make sure these women get a really good education that will fit them for the world. Yeah.
There's a hand back there. Sandy, there's a hand back there.
The complication of race and gender, just as the previous comments indicated, do not necessarily create change. I think the issues are somewhat subsumed to the mission of whatever organization women and minorities find themselves included in. So my question is, with the increased diversity of institutions, is it any more likely that change will happen when women and minorities find themselves recruited to the very agenda of those same institutions about inclusion and exclusion?
No. In a word. But the question, and that's why, I mean, I'm from California, where the University of California, some of our campuses are majority minority campuses. And I was saying that we have 65% of our student population are students of color, various international, national bodies, over 50% female. And we're still, I mean, we haven't transformed. So it has to do with the next stage of diversity for institutions like ours is what's the value added? What does it mean to have these populations coming together? And what is the role of enlightened administrators and faculty to answer that question? It's a wonderful resource, but, you know, we could limp along as other institutions are and not take advantage of that. But that's not what we want to do. And so we do actually want to empower the students and to, as Norma says, turn to them and say, what did you come here for? Why are you this particular institution versus another? And our students will say they came because they liked having a critical mass of students that looked like them, but they were not, so they wouldn't feel isolated, and to sort of be in that give and take and rough and tumble of being in an institution where that is different from other institutions. So it's up to us. I think the jury's out on what we do with that, and that's what my talk was about. What do we do to empower people to not be bystanders, but to be agents of their own change within these institutions? And how do we instill that kind of leadership in our students and in junior faculty and in staff so that they are the voices of change within the university, and it isn't just coming from the top down, but it has to be, you know, kind of opened up. And I'll let other people speak to that.
I think also that if you know the work of Estella Ben Simon, you know Estella Ben Simon's work on she has something called the Diversity Scorecard. I think what Estella says, and it's probably because she works out of California, the California schools as well, is that she says the numbers by themselves don't mean anything. She really wants institutions to, again, look reflexively at how they're training these students. Are these students the ones with the lower GPAs? Are they the ones that are failing or opting out of the calculus gatekeeping courses? How well is an institution doing in terms of graduating these students well, so that they can then have choices about what they want to do and where they want to be. And so that's what I mean by you can't be an automatic pilot. And the way that you know that you're an automatic pilot is the extent to which you're doing diversity well. And what I mean by that is not just how many people come and how many people graduate, but what is the gap? Where do they end up in terms of their majors? What's the difference between what they said they wanted to be when they came and what they ended up? How much was that driven by their own choices, and how much was it driven by, in some ways, the failure of the institution to train them well and effectively? How are we teaching in the sciences? How competent are our faculty in teaching these students in these courses that are really, they rule you in or out? So that's a whole other level, another way of thinking about diversity that Estella is a real champion of, and it really is driven by institutions being willing to expose themselves, to the failures and to look at the numbers and to risk, because you got to be really willing to risk looking and seeing. And you have to have a certain wisdom about that as an institution, because you don't want to shame your students in doing that. And then you have to be willing to say, like Norma said, what are the solutions?
Here's a question.
You've talked a bit and asked us a lot of questions, yet you three are all in leadership positions and presumably have fought the hard fight and are there now. So I'm wondering from each of you, we could hear one model thing that you, an answer in other words, something that you've done at your institution or that you can see us doing very soon, not necessarily here but somewhere in the ideal world, that would make a difference in the whole culture of diversity. Because I hear the same questions year after year. I've been in institutions since the 60s, and even not even seen much, a whole lot of change in the number of females, never mind the number of people of color.
I mean here,
Yes.
or
No, not here the whole time, but various places, the East, here, various other places. So you're saying these things have to happen fast, and I agree, they should be on a fast track. But I would like to hear what you particularly have as an idea, not just a question to us, but also an idea for what can be moved along.
I thought I actually had given you that. All right, so let me back up a little bit. I think, first of all, that women actually have probably done numerically, and in terms of in the ranks, white women have done relatively well, comparatively speaking, if you look at the growth in numbers. So, that has been a huge change, I think, for the faculty I'm talking about, and also for undergraduate enrollments. I think the one thing I was pointing to was the work of institutions that are working with Estella Ben Simon on the diversity index, because it takes administrators and faculty coming together and really looking closely at the data for their students, in particular for their minority students, and seeing where the failures are, and then applying specific solutions to it. Okay, they seem to really be failing at calculus. Why is that? What are we doing wrong with calculus? What kind of teaching do we need to be doing? Which professor do we need to be using for this course? And doing that, just going through the curriculum and looking in that very grounded way, and then coming up with a plan, a team-based plan as to how to make that change. Another one that I talked about in the morning was that I feel, and it's a project that I'm working on in my institution, that being much more organizationally open about the process of recruitment of faculty and the work of search committees, and being willing to be self-interrogating about how search committees make decisions, and what are the said and unsaid rules about how we measure merit and excellence. That's something that I'm working on in my institution, where I feel that we haven't given this a whole lot of thought. So the search committee process and how it operates is another area that I think they're very concrete things that can get done.
Two examples, and this is a national issue, looking at why retention is not good for students of color in many predominantly white institutions. I mentioned this before. That is, what is happening? Why are they falling by the wayside? And this means collecting the data and disaggregating the data and knowing who your students are. That's really important. It's only half of the equation to recruit students. The other half is to make sure that you're successful and getting them matriculating through your programs, whatever those programs are. And the second thing, and it actually, maybe I should have even said it first, is that each institution has to define for itself what diversity means and what the issues are they want to tackle. And that has to come from your own sense of generating and churning and self-reflection about what it is, what kind of institution do you really want to be? And the kind of interrogation needs to take place with leadership at all levels, including in students. And oftentimes it means putting that blueprint in place and having everybody have a piece of that blueprint and being responsible for it, having outcomes, and having accountability measures. Because otherwise, as you said, you can be talking about the same thing years and years and years down the road if you don't have concrete ways of looking at implementation and looking at change. Even if, as Gertrude says, you don't get it right the first time, at least you're committing to doing in some institutional change work.
I can point to some examples at UT Austin, I mean, where I'm based now. And I sued them too, and they still hired me. So, oh, and I sued the Department of Education before I took the job, and they still hired me. We've reached out to allies outside of the university world. I mean, when Hopwood happened to us, our state senator, Rodney Ellis, who's African-American, called friends he knew at American Airlines, and they donated vouchers for airfare for any African-American who was admitted to the law school. They'd get a round-trip ticket to come visit the school, courtesy of the private sector. And so there was no Hopwood problem because it wasn't state-funded financial aid. It was an airline that seriously wanted to be sure that African-Americans still felt welcome. And that helped because, you know, students got to meet other students, got to meet faculty, and they came. We're listed in Hispanic Magazine as the #1 law school for Latinos in the country. In part, it's because we have a 100% career office placement rate. So it's a selling feature to be able to tell every graduate, we guarantee you a job when you finish. Okay? That means that we've built a reputation and some credibility with those law firms and those agencies outside of our university community. So it's allies. And our students themselves, their #1 job is to work hard as being a student, and they get the grades. But they also remember where they came from. And so our Latino and African-American students visit junior highs and talk to 6th graders and 7th graders about what kind of classes they need to take so that they can become lawyers too. So they pass that baton back to the next generation of kids. So there's some models. I mean, there's some models. Hope that helped.
Oh, you know, the other one, I just thought of this one because we're doing it at the university. When your faculty come in, they have to have there are at least 3 kinds of mentors they need. They need mentors around their research and writing. This is a deep, dirty secret about being a faculty member. Writing doesn't stop being hard. And you sometimes come in and you feel like an imposter. You know, I got my dissertation. My God, why can't I get this article done? And why this book kicking my butt? You know, and you can't talk about it because, you know, it's so inappropriate. So getting mentors that will help faculty in terms of their research, funding, and writing. Getting them mentors that are what we call organizational mentors, so that they kind of have people who can give them the lay of the land. You know, who are the important people that you need to know? How are things put together? What does the organizational chart look like, and who are the different people? That kind of mentor. And then we also give a mentor around teaching, because this is another critical. I'm talking about tenure track faculty now. So for the right now, it's a relatively small program. We try to focus it on faculty who we think are particularly vulnerable, and it could be because they're coming in as joint appointments.
Oh, that's
a biggie. They're coming in departments where they're the only African American or the only first generation faculty member. So people who we feel are going to have early career issues. And we offer them this mentorship and also the networking among themselves across departments, so they don't feel trapped and isolated in departments. And that has proved extremely effective for our first and second year faculty who, when I did focus group with them, they point to that program as being the thing that really got them. The first year is so critical, as you know, got them very well rooted in their first year at the university. So that's another practical kind of thing.
Last question? Yes, back.
Familiar with Gene Green and Rodney Allen. I actually did some work for Rod Page before he went up to be the education director. Your sort of journey is really interesting, and as a third-year law student, can you speak about maybe if you're interested in pursuing the type of civil rights that you've done, what would you say to students who are interested in maybe what kind of journey should we take? Would you recommend similar to yours, or is there other paths to get to that level?
The advice I was given as a second-year student is the difference between a job you like and a job you love is about $30,000. So I never figured out how to get the job I love and still make the top salary that I wanted to make. So I'm the wrong person to ask. But the other thing I found out was I took the job I loved. I mean, I took the job that allowed me to sue my mother's school principal, right? But you know what I found was, because I must have been like exuding just joy at doing work that I found challenging and being able to make a real difference as far as the funding available for our schools and colleges, people would treat me like a pet. I mean, I'd walk into a restaurant and my money was no good there. You know, you're eating on the house. I could call any city that I needed to go do an investigation, and I would be put up at people's homes like a favorite long-lost relative. School board members that I was suing wanted me to stay at their house. I mean, I had one trial that was going too long, and the president of the school board, because I was complaining that my dog missed me, he said, "Oh, have him shipped up, and I'll take care of him here while you do this lawsuit." I mean, there was just something magical happening, because people saw that the kind of cases we were bringing, or cases that needed to be brought. Judges went through years of boring divorces, and then they get a case where judges can make a difference. I mean, I brought the case of desegregated Odessa, Texas. Odessa was the #1 handgun murder capital of the U.S. And I worked on a case because south of the tracks it was all black and Latino, and north of the tracks it was white, rich white, mojo, state championship football white, okay? And the coaches didn't want that place desegregated. And they told me, and they told the Department of Justice, don't mess with our schools. And we said, do you want to recruit from a small pool or a big pool? And then they thought about it. And we said, can we cite you, not some cases, but can we cite you the precedent of Gregory and Portland? And when they integrated, they went to the state championships. And Beaumont and Port Arthur, when they integrated, they went to the state championships. And Odessa integrated, and they went to the state championships. So, yeah, I mean, the stories about doing civil rights work, public interest work, are stories I'm going to have bragging rights on when I'm an old lady of 97 years. But I'm not driving a Lexus. I'm not driving a Mercedes. I'm not living in the same style that my classmates have accustomed themselves to. But they write checks and they donate them to the causes I work for.